I've kind of started this unofficial, very sporadic series on my channel where I taste test a new to me author or almost completely new to me author, just try a few of their books and see if their writing style, if their stories and characters and the themes that they're interested in appeal to me as a reader, so I can add them into my regular rotation of authors to pick up. In the past, I've done this with authors like Robin Hobb and Stephen King. I'll link those reading vlogs down below. But today I am very excited for the author I'm going to be checking out. And the author in question, which you probably already know because I'm sure I put it in the title, is Saara El-Arifi. Saara was raised in Abu Dhabi before her family moved to Sheffield in England. She has a BA in theater studies. As a theater kid with a degree in musical theater, I feel a kindred spirit, and a master's degree in African studies. Her debut novel, The Final Strife, which was book 1 in a fantasy trilogy, was published in 2022, and she went on to publish a second fantasy trilogy and has just recently published her first historical fiction retelling. I'm going to start with one that was the impetus to film this video because I was lucky enough to get a physical ARC from the publisher. I'm always excited when this happens. It's like Christmas morning every time. And that is Cleopatra. This is Saara El-Arifi's most recent publication. And this was just published early March 2026. And it is historical fiction focused on Cleopatra, as you might imagine. And the blurb says, Cleopatra tells her own story in this evocative and sensuous historical epic from the best-selling and award-winning author of Faebound and The Final Strife. You know my name, but you do not know me. Your historians call me seductress, but I was ever in love's thrall. Your playwrights speak of witchcraft, but my talents came from the gods themselves. Your poets sing of my bloodlust, but I was always protecting my children. How willfully they refused to concede that a woman could be powerful, strategic, and divinely blessed to rule. Death will silence me no longer. This is not the story of how I died, but how I lived. I can't wait. I think a lot of people find Cleopatra to be a fascinating historical figure, and I am no different. I am basic in that respect. I also find her fascinating, and I'm so excited to read this. And thank you again to Ballantine Books, an imprint at Random House, for sending me a copy. Very excited. And the second book I'll be reading for this video is the first book in one of her 2 fantasy trilogies, Faebound. I was on the fence about which of her 2 trilogies I wanted to sample first, but this is the one that I've had recommended to me most in my comments. I get asked if I have read or asked if I will read Faebound pretty regularly in my comments across platforms. So I thought that I might start with Faebound and just see how I feel. Let me read the blurb to you. 2 elven sisters become imprisoned in the intoxicating world of the Fae, where danger and love lie in wait. Faebound is the first book in an enchanting new trilogy from the Sunday Times bestselling author of The Final Strife. Yiren was born on the battlefield, has lived on the battlefield, and one day, she knows, will die on the battlefield. As a warrior in the elven army, Yiren has known nothing but violence her whole life. Her sister, Lettel, is trying to make a living as a diviner, seeking prophecies of a better future. When a fatal mistake leads to Yiren's exile from the elven lands, both sisters are forced into the terrifying wilderness beyond their borders. There they encounter the impossible, the Fae court. The Fae haven't been seen for a millennium, but now Yiren and Lettel are thrust into their seductive world, torn among their loyalties to each other, their elven homeland, and their hearts. So if you are as excited about this taste test as I am, give this video a like, leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on Saara El-Arifi, if you have tried her works, which book you think I'm going to like best, or which one you are more interested in or excited about based on those blurbs, and settle in, because this might be a long one, but it's going to be a good one. I can feel it in my bones. So I'm going to go start Cleopatra, and I'll be back when I get to the halfway point to let you know how it's going. I can't wait. Okay, I'll be back. know anything about me, you know that I try to be intentional about how I live my life. It's really important to me that I consider how my habits and the products I use impact the planet I live on and the animals that live on this planet. And that is why I'm so excited to be partnering with this video sponsor, Suri. I really care about my dental hygiene. It's something that's really important to me. I won't get into it now, but I have some tooth-related trauma in my past. And for that reason, it's very important to me that I take care of my teeth and keep them as healthy as I possibly can. And in pursuit of that, I have really struggled to find a toothbrush that I can be happy with. Manual toothbrushes don't give you as deep of a clean and are disposable, but most electric toothbrushes are poorly designed and made of plastic and require constantly buying new brush heads that are just going to go in a landfill. And that is why I am so excited to partner with this video sponsor, Suri. Suri's electric toothbrush has a sleek sonic design with an intentional minimalist aesthetic. It comes in a few different colors, and I chose Winter Fern because, as you know, I love green. With a slim aluminum body, plant-based brush heads recycled for free by Suri, get a dentist-approved gentle and powerful clean with a brush that has over 10,000 five-star reviews. I also love the UVC cleaning travel case for a hygienic and portable routine. Everything has magnets, which is so satisfying, and the case has an equally minimalist and aesthetic design. There are multiple ways to charge your Suri toothbrush, but the best thing is that it has a month plus battery life, so you don't have to charge it every single night. Not even close. It also comes with a magnetic mirror mount to keep your counter clean and cable-free. I also really appreciate that it comes with a pressure sensor because I am the kind of person who gets a little vigorous when I'm brushing because I can't help but feel, no matter how many times my hygienist tells me otherwise, that brushing harder means my teeth will get cleaner. But that is not true, and my Suri toothbrush helps me to remember to be gentle with my teeth even as I get a deep clean. Use my code PLANT15 to get an extra 15% off Suri. You'll see why I love it so much. Thank you again so much to Suri for partnering with me on this video, and click the link in my description box or use this QR code to shop. I'm halfway through Cleopatra and I'm having a great time. This is so good. Okay, let me organize my thoughts. I don't want to make this update too long, in part because I just want to go finish it. I'm really enjoying it, so I want to go read. And I feel like once I'm done, I can speak more fully on all these things. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but basically my thoughts so far are, generally, I really like the writing style. It is doing this thing of breaking the fourth wall, speaking directly to the reader, acknowledging that the reader probably has heard many things about Cleopatra, and also the narrator, who is Cleopatra. It is in first person, otherwise she is speaking from beyond the grave with knowledge of modern interpretations of herself. And for the most part, I don't mind that. I think it's an interesting choice, and there are times where that is injecting some humor and some interesting and biting commentary on how Cleopatra has been portrayed and the implications therein, and I like that. I do think a couple times, just a handful of times, it's a little on the nose. Just sometimes. A couple of those interjections, a couple of those footnotes or fourth wall breaks feel a little too heavy-handed for me. For the most part, I'm still enjoying it. It hasn't been so heavy-handed that I'm getting sick of it, but it's teetering on the edge because there are a couple there that I just thought, we didn't need that. And there are a couple times where it sort of takes us out of the emotion or the tension of a scene by reminding us how it ends, or her commenting on how, well, this isn't going to happen now, but this is what happens later. And a lot of it is stuff that, again, is very much in the collective consciousness. Anyone reading this probably knows those details, but while you're reading, it's nice to kind of forget that and be immersed sometimes. So it's hit or miss for me so far. More hit than miss, but I wanted to note that. I do like the writing, though. I really like the characterization of Cleopatra. I'm finding her very complex and flawed and interesting. I feel like she's already had a lot of growth, even though it's been, I think, maybe 4 years so far since the beginning of the book. We're in 47 BCE. Yeah, 4 years. So it's not been a huge amount of time, but I do feel like she's had a lot of growth as a person, as a character, as a queen, and her relationships have been evolving with the people around her in a really interesting way. So I'm enjoying following her. She's a very gentle, generous, sort of bookish kind of character, which is a really interesting interpretation of her. But she also has all the traits that we typically associate with Cleopatra of being sort of clever and confident and fierce and stubborn and maybe having a hot temper. And that is balanced with other traits, and most people have a mix of traits. And I do think it's interesting to see her sort of grow into her legend as the book progresses, at least so far, that's what we're seeing. And I find it a really interesting detail that she is really squeamish around blood and killing, and that's something she's having to get used to because of the circumstances she's in over the course of the novel so far. I also really like Caesar and how he's being depicted, and I really like their relationship. I am pleasantly surprised by how honestly wholesome it is. Never thought I'd say that a depiction of Cleopatra and Caesar felt wholesome, but it does. There's a lot of tenderness, and there have been a few scenes that had me giggling and blushing and kicking my feet a little bit. Did not expect that. And a lot of sexual tension. I think it's very well written. Their relationship feels very genuine. And again, it feels like Saara El-Arifi is really trying to depict Cleopatra in a more whole light. And as the very young woman that she is, her having had more experience with women in the past than with men, and that sort of being a point of contrast to her depiction in popular media as this sort of man-eater, seductress, femme fatale. This idea that she actually struggles to ask for what she wants, and it takes a long time for their relationship to develop into something and cross that line because she's very young and inexperienced in that way, and sort of unable to express herself. At least with men, she does have a history of a sexual relationship with a woman, and that is depicted as sort of an open, long-term loving relationship, which I also am really appreciating. Both Cleopatra and Caesar are depicted as openly and happily bisexual, and I appreciate that. And we also get her female partner is also openly and happily bisexual. So there's just a lot of openness and love, which, again, not sure that I totally expected that, but I'm really appreciating the representation so far, and also just the way that the relationships are being handled. Both her relationship with Caesar and her relationship with her female partner are depicted as very loving, supportive, caring, tender relationships. And I think that's really nice. I really like that. I don't know off the top of my head a huge amount about Cleopatra and her life. I am not constantly fact-checking things in my mind as I go along because I know details of her life vaguely, but I'm not a scholar and I haven't necessarily taken an extreme interest in Cleopatra's life. So I'm not, if there are a lot of historical inaccuracies, if there's a lot of liberties being taken, I'm not noticing them. There is an acknowledgement in the author's note at the beginning that there isn't a huge amount known for sure about her life, and there's a lot of conflicting accounts, and the accounts are not necessarily the most vigorous or like confirmable accounts. And so there are some liberties being taken, but that El-Arifi is really trying to portray her in that sort of holistic, whole person and respectful light. And I can feel that so far. I also just think it's nice to read. It's easy to read. It's a quick read. There are some nice turns of phrase here and there. The descriptions of the setting are typically pretty good to sort of set the scene. There's actual magic, which I did not expect. Real magic powers. For some reason, I thought it was going to be more realistic than that. But some of these characters have blessings from the gods that give them actual magic powers. So I didn't see that coming, but it is pretty mild in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't read like it's fantasy, but maybe more leaning into like a retelling where the gods are real in a myth or something. So I think I would prefer it without that, to be totally honest, but it's not having a huge impact on the story so far, so I can let it go. It does have some nice quotes and some good moments. I do feel like occasionally, along with the fourth wall breaks that sometimes pull me out of it, I do think sometimes the ends of chapters are a little more cliffhangery is the wrong word, but they just sometimes are really, really foreshadowing very heavily in a way that's a little overdramatic for my taste. I'm trying to find a quick example for you that isn't also a spoiler, but it's just a bit of a style that is not my favorite, where almost every chapter feels like it's making some dramatic statement about the future, even centuries into the future. Like, then I stepped into the bedroom of the Consul of Rome and set history course. Pretty dramatic, but fine. Here's another end of a chapter. And so it began, the erasure of my history. Like, I don't mind it necessarily. I just feel like when most chapters end that way, it starts to feel a little too constructed for my taste. And obviously a book has to be very constructed. You know, it's very artificial in that a lot of time and effort has gone into it, and, you know, a lot of debating how to write certain things and working it, and as it should, you know, it's a craft and it takes work and effort. But I do find it a little put on, maybe a little theatrical, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I do like theatrical. I have a theater degree. I like drama. I like plays, but I do find it a little bit ancient theater in a way that the breaking the fourth wall also feels like that at times. And I don't hate it. I just think it's maybe used a little too often. I think if it was strategically placed every, 6 or 7 chapters, it would land more with me as a reader. But when it's used almost every single chapter, if not every chapter, then it starts to feel a little overdone and a little dramatic and very, on the stage and performative, not in the way we typically use that word, but hopefully you know what I mean. I think if it was used more sparingly, I would like it better. Basically, that's what I'm saying. But I'm liking it. I'm liking it a lot. I want to know what happens. I'm really rooting for Cleopatra, even though I know how it ends. So it's kind of depressing. But I'm liking it. I like her. I'm liking the story. I like the writing. I'm finding it very immersive. I'm finding myself wanting to keep reading. I basically read the first half in a single sitting, pretty much, if that's an indication. And I'm very excited to read the second half. So those are my thoughts so far. I'm not going to do a spoiler section, in part because I think a lot of the spoilers are plot things that, again, are not spoilers if you've probably soaked up some of these details from just existing in the world about Cleopatra, but also because there's honestly not too much to spoil about the first half. And again, I think maybe when I get to the end, I can talk about the whole thing in spoilers if I feel that I need to. Yeah, I'm liking it so far. Generally liking it. Some critiques here and there, but I feel like they're pretty minor. I'm having a good time with it. I really like Cleopatra. I really like Caesar. I really like Charmian, her handmaiden and lover. And there's some other characters as well, sort of in the periphery, that I like a lot. There was even a trans character who showed up for a bit, which was very cool. I don't know if he'll come back again, but I liked him and it was cool for him to be there. But yeah, that's it. I'm liking it. I'm going to go finish it. I'll be back. I'll have more to say. I just finished Cleopatra probably 3 minutes ago. And honestly, I'm a little at a loss for words. I liked this. I'll say that first. I liked this a lot. It was a very easy read. It was beautifully written, but not overwritten and very easy to follow. And while I did find the fourth wall breaks and some of the sort of formulaic ends of chapters heavily foreshadowing or just telling us what was to come a little bit repetitive by the end, generally I really liked it. I liked the characterization. I liked the writing style. What I will say is that while I appreciate that this focused on Cleopatra as a person more than a ruler, in that it focused on her relationships, her domestic life, her relationship with her parents, with her siblings, and then later on with lovers, friends, husbands, and her children. And I think that that was something clearly very intentional and something that Saara El-Arifi was trying to explore, and something about her that's maybe not highlighted as often, her personal relationships, at least not in a more tender, loving, caring way as it is here. And I did appreciate that. And I did find her relationships interesting, even extending to her relationships with animals. I thought that was quite nice. And while I understand wanting to spend the majority of the book focused on those interpersonal relationships and her development as a person outside of being a ruler and outside of the myth of Cleopatra as pharaoh, I did kind of want more of her as a ruler, of Cleopatra as pharaoh, you know? The fact that she was pharaoh is why everyone is so interested in her, you know? And while you don't have to be a ruler of a great kingdom to be an interesting person to write or read a book about, it does feel a little odd to spend so little time on her as a ruler. I feel like pretty much every time she was ruling or, you know, engaged in strategy or battle, it was kind of brushed over pretty quickly, a little bit more like a montage or a quick chapter, and then we're back to domestic life. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think I just wanted a touch more balance. It still could have been more heavily weighted to her interpersonal relationships and her day-to-day life, but I just wanted a little bit more of her as a ruler. The book is not that long. It's around 330 pages. So this easily could have been a little bit longer. I feel like I usually complain about books being too long and rambling on or being bloated, but in this case, I think we could have had more. I mean, she didn't necessarily have the longest life, but a lot happened in her life. I don't think that a 400 or 500 page book trying to cover the years of her rule, the years as pharaoh, would be too much. And I was enjoying this enough that I could have happily read more in between the scenes we got. And it wasn't just her as a ruler that I thought was sort of sped through. There were a couple significant moments for her in her interpersonal relationships that I felt were kind of skimmed over in a way that didn't make a huge amount of sense to me. I think the period after Caesar's death was rushed through. For me, it didn't make sense to skip over that time period so quickly. Considering how much time was spent building up their relationship, I would have loved even just one more chapter spent in the aftermath of that and her struggling with the loss. And then we sort of jump into the build-up and development of her relationship with her second husband. And I just felt like that was a little rushed too. We had such a slow build between her and Caesar. And while I think, again, not an expert in the real life of Cleopatra and what's known about her in the timeline, I think it would make sense for her to fall faster the second time, potentially. But I did feel like it was a little rushed to the point where I really felt the love between her and Caesar, and I didn't feel like I had enough time to fall in love with her again the second time. And part of that was not enough time spent mourning the first loss, and then just not enough time spent building up the next love. I did end up liking their dynamic together. I do think that it was well written. Again, there was a lot of tenderness and banter and what felt like genuine care and respect and, you know, sexual tension and love. I think that one thing that I've definitely picked up on from reading this that makes me really excited to try Faebound is I feel that Saara El-Arifi writes romance really well, writes relationships between people, and writes the love and the tenderness really well, which is something that I find often lacking in the books that I read. And so I appreciated that, and I did end up understanding their connection once we got towards the end, but I just felt like the pacing was a little uneven for me. in that middle section. And then when we get to the end, again, everything is very fast, wrapped up very quickly, and again, possibly true to life because I'm not an expert in the timeline of her life. But even if, I feel like I've said this a lot, the pacing of a book, even if it's based on a real person, doesn't have to match the literal time events took in real life. Things don't have to be a one-to-one comparison. The pacing of the book doesn't have to be to scale. We can spend a little bit more time on significant moments, and we don't always have to. Sometimes fast pacing works for the storytelling. Here, I just felt like we were rushing through it a little bit more. I wanted to sit with it a little longer. I felt like even though this book is not very long, I felt like I'd experienced a lot with Cleopatra and lived with her through a lot. And I wanted a little bit more time for the resolution of her story and for some of that development in the middle. We also skipped ahead quite a bit at one point, which is fine. Honestly, I would say the whole sort of second half felt a little rushed to me in comparison to the first half. And really, extending this to 400 or 500 pages, I think those who are picking this up would be more than willing to read that much. And from how this was executed, I could imagine Saara El-Arifi doing a great job filling those pages with value and relationship development and more moments of tenderness and love and grief and conflict and a few more snippets of Cleopatra as a ruler in there. But overall, I really liked this. I enjoyed it a lot. I feel like I look conflicted because I cannot decide what my rating is going to be for this. I'm going to do the spoiler section. I do want to talk about the ending of this. And then I will hopefully, over the course of talking about the ending, I will decide on a rating because I'm feeling a bit conflicted. So spoilers for Cleopatra. I would not watch the spoilers even if you know a lot about Cleopatra's life, because these are spoilers for the book and how the book is handled, not for what we know of real life history for Cleopatra. So you've been warned. Watch at your own peril. Okay, spoilers. The ending here. Okay, like I mentioned in my first review, I don't know how I feel about making the magic real, making the gods real. I think it's fine. I guess I just expected it to be more sort of dry, realistic historical fiction. So including gifts from the gods and magic powers is not really something I expected, and also not something I needed personally. And I mean, I'm a big fantasy reader. I love magic in the books I read, but I also don't need magic to be in the books I read. And I think this would have been possibly even more effective without the magic. That being said, the final twist of the book and the ending is that Cleopatra did in fact have a gift from Isis. She thought her whole life that she had been spurned, that she was marked by Isis, but never given her God-given power. And she taught herself to be a healer and sort of passed that off as her God-given gift. But it was something she learned as a scholar, a skill that she built, not a gift from the gods. And I kind of liked that because I enjoyed what felt like the message, which was that she was a self-built woman, that she was a ruler and a powerful one, and that she managed to outlive all her siblings despite them all having literal magic powers given from the gods. She was the only one who was skipped over for magical power, but she had the strength of character and the intelligence and the resilience and on to be successful and to be the victor. Unfortunately, though, that was not the message, because she did have a power. Her power was immortal life, basically being resurrected every time she dies. And the twist is that she's still alive now, which is why we're getting all these fourth wall breaks, and she's talking about her life directly to us from the future, because she is still alive. Every time she dies, she comes back to life at the age she was the first time she died, and therefore watches her loved ones die around her and watches the world manipulate and alter her story, take hold of the narrative, and just has to watch it happen and continue to live forever. It is framed as a bit of a positive thing in that she gets to be more anonymous and to become a scholar and an academic, which she always wanted to be. But there is also, of course, the double-edged sword of losing everyone you love, watching everyone you love, including your children, die, and having to outlive them and never being at rest. On the one hand, it's an interesting twist. I don't necessarily hate it. Do I love it, though? I don't know. I think in general, I didn't need the magic. And then when I kind of tried to get used to the idea of the magic being real, I liked the message I was picking up on for why she didn't have powers and what that said about her as a person. But then for her to have powers and the powers to be tied, specifically for the powers from the gods to not be blessings but a curse, to punish them for what their ancestor did, and that each of their gifts would be their demise, and turned out to be so for all of her siblings, including her, and hers is that she was the last one to be cursed of her line. Her children weren't marked and didn't have a curse because they were born out of love. And her curse is that she's going to die over and over again for an eternity. And she's sort of the final one to pay for her ancestor. I don't know how I feel about that, to be honest. I guess it makes sense on a certain level logically for these gods, if they were real, to take this sort of vengeance on a whole family line. I don't love it in terms of, children paying for the crimes of their parents or their grandparents or their great-great-grandparents. Like, it would be one thing if it was using this as a metaphor to examine generational trauma, but that's not what it's doing. It just kind of dropped on us and the book ends very quickly, and I don't know how I feel about it. It's fine. I don't hate it. I just think it doesn't necessarily add anything thematically. I'm not sure that it deepens my appreciation for Cleopatra or my understanding of her. It's a twist and it's surprising, but does it do anything for me in terms of the story that's being told and in terms of how we frame Cleopatra as a person? Not really. Again, I think, not to toot my own horn, but my own interpretation of her not having powers, not being blessed by the gods, but still having the strength to rule, based on, embracing learning and knowledge and working with others and trusting people. And, it didn't turn out well for her, unfortunately, but that she was able to hold on to power much longer than her siblings for those reasons, despite not being blessed by the gods. That, to me, would have been more impactful, I think, as a message. And again, that's clearly not what Saara El-Arifi was trying to do because of the twist. But since the twist doesn't come in until the very end, started sort of building a framework around who Cleopatra was within the context of the novel and her lack of magic when everyone else in her family had magic powers, So it makes sense, based on how it's set up, for the reader to develop their own interpretation and understanding of what these choices are doing narratively, only to have the rug kind of pulled out from under you. And that's kind of what a twist does. I didn't expect a twist, because why would I expect a twist in a book about Cleopatra? Again, I don't hate it. I'm just not sure it does anything meaningful for me personally as a reader. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you've read this, what did you think of the twist at the ending? How did you interpret it? How did it land for you? Like I said, I finished this about 3 minutes before filming this, so maybe in a few days, I will suddenly have an epiphany of what it means and it will really land well for me, or the opposite, and I'll hate it. Who knows? But right now, I just kind of don't think it does anything other than surprise the reader, sorta. I guess it gives her the life she always wanted, sort of, in that she gets to be an academic. But I don't know. For me, that's not enough. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you've read it, please mark your comment with spoilers for Cleopatra before you share your thoughts so we don't spoil other people for the twist. I don't even really want to talk about there being a twist because I don't want to set people up to expect it because, again, who would expect a twist in a book about Cleopatra? I just don't know how to feel about it. I finished my review and turned everything off, and then I had a thought, so I turned everything back on again. I just want to say that as I think about the ending more, I do wonder if it's meant to be a literal representation of Cleopatra living on in our minds, living on as a legend, continuing to exist in our collective consciousness, in our imagination, in our histories, in the stories we tell, in the archetypes of women, for good and for ill. I think that might be what Saara was trying to get at with the ending and the twist. And I don't hate that necessarily because that's certainly something that comes up through the whole novel, through the whole story, that Cleopatra has become sort of this myth, this legend that is separated from her as a person. And it's even mentioned in that epilogue that she was finally able to return to herself as just a person and live her life anonymously, come back to who she was before she became the pharaoh, and just be a person instead of the legend and the myth. And I think that is, representative of what the novel is trying to do in general, is bring us back to Cleopatra as a person and to consider her as a person first rather than pharaoh first, which also sort of explains some of the lack of exploration of her as a ruler in general, which again is fine if that's the scope that Saara El-Arifi was trying to explore there. I just personally wanted a little bit more to have the fullness of who she was, because she also was a ruler. And ruling Egypt was a pretty big deal for her entire life and took up a lot of her time, I can imagine. Anyway, I just wanted to share that thought that occurred to me. I think that that makes sense, and I think that's a fair thing to try to drive home. I do think that the novel did a good enough job of driving home that message throughout, especially in the fourth wall breaks. As it is, I don't think we needed the twist at the end to really communicate that message and drive it home. I think the whole book is really about Cleopatra being more than the myth, and also simultaneously being a myth that is immortal. I don't think we needed the twist for that to land, because it was there the whole time. But I can understand wanting to reinforce that theme in the end. I guess I just feel it's a little bit redundant at that point, not in a terrible way, but just in a little bit on the nose kind of way. And I guess that echoes my criticism throughout of the fourth wall breaks occasionally feeling a little bit on the nose and a little repetitive. I think the ending could have landed, again, if we're bringing it back to Cleopatra just being a person, just being a woman, and having more to her than this myth, then maybe her dying as a woman and being mortal is more impactful. But maybe that's just more impactful for me and for the reader that I am. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, but I did want to pop in and say that, because as soon as I turned the camera off, I was like, well, there's also this. So maybe I'll be back again 3 or 4 more times with more ideas, or maybe I'll just save them for when I come back to review Faebound. If I have more to say, I'll share it then. But I would love to chat with you more in the comments about this, because I'm sure there are many different ways to take it and to interpret it. But that's it. I'm going to go now. Okay, bye. But that's it. I just wanted to say that. Okay, goodbye. That's all I'm going to say about the ending. And unfortunately, that didn't really help me clarify my rating. I think right now I am sitting at 4 stars. I think if I gave half stars, I would be giving this 3.5 stars, but I don't give half stars. So I'm going to round up to 4. I think that feels fair based on my experience through most of the book, and the fact that I really did enjoy it and found it very readable and really liked the characters, found it quite immersive. There are some things that I wish to have more of, areas where I wanted a little more balance, and I'm not sure still how I feel about the ending. I have to let myself percolate a little bit longer on that. But I think it's 4 stars for me. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this if you have read Cleopatra, if you are talking about spoilers for the book specifically, not necessarily Cleopatra's life, because that's, just sort of public knowledge, but if you're talking about choices made in the book, especially those that might diverge from real life, please put spoilers on your comments so people can avoid it if they haven't read this yet. But I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts, especially on the ending, because I feel a little flummoxed. And that's where I'll leave it, I guess. But I am excited to read Faebound. I feel like I don't look excited. I'm just still a bit confused by the choices made at the end of Cleopatra, the narrative choices to conclude the novel in the way that she did. I don't know how I feel about it. I don't hate it. I just find it confusing. And so I'm sort of sitting in that confusion still. But regardless, I'm excited to read Faebound. I'm going to go start it and just see what I see. And I'll come back when I get to the halfway point to tell you how it's going. I have high hopes. So let's do it. All right, I'm halfway through Faebound. as you can see, and this is going really fast. I spent about 2 hours reading and I'm halfway through. I can definitely sense that it's the same author. There is a certain voice and writing style that feels consistent between the two, but I would say that this is written more simply and in a more straightforward fashion than Cleopatra, which was a little bit more elevated or poetic. This feels a little bit more, I don't know if I'd say typical romantasy, but a little bit more of that like contemporary casual dialogue and a little more pared back that is very popular in YA fantasy and in romantasy, and a little less so in traditional adult epic fantasy that typically has a little bit more of an epic or elevated language. Obviously not universally, but just trends that I've noticed. I would say that this does read a little bit like YA fantasy, and like I say every time I bring that up, I don't mean that as a bad thing, because there's nothing wrong with books being YA. There's nothing wrong with books being written for a YA audience, and there is sort of a certain style or tone or sort of accessibility of the language and dynamic. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not typically my personal preference. I will say that the characters are full-grown adults. The youngest character is 28. However, they are elves with very long lifespans. So being 28 kind of makes our youngest character, Lettel, the younger sister of our protagonist pairing, it kind of makes her a young adult or like barely out of her teens because of the scale of their ages, or at least it seems like that's the logic here. That hasn't explicitly been stated, but it does kind of feel that way. Now, it is possible that typically a 28-year-old elf would be considered a full-grown adult and treated as such, and that this dynamic is just a little different because they're sisters. Being a younger sister myself, I know what it's like to sometimes continue to be treated like the baby of the family and like your little kid, even when you are well into adulthood. I don't know for sure which one it is because we don't have any direct comparison for other elves of her age, but I do think that Yiren is in her 30s and she's fully grown, regular aged adult. And Ryan, his name is Ryan, like not Ryan, but close enough. I do side-eye the choice to name this dude Ryan. It's fine. Anyway, Ryan, I believe, is 32 or something along those lines, if I did my math right, when he was telling that anecdote about his childhood. So they're kind of all around the same age. I would say that Yiren and Ryan sort of read as your typical mid to late 20s protagonist in a fantasy, whereas Lettel comes across more like 18 to 20 in terms of her behavior and her dynamic with the other characters. But again, I don't know if that's a big sister, little sister dynamic thing, or if it's a scaling their ages to fit a slightly longer lifespan thing, you know? Either way, this does read a little bit more like YA than I expected it to. I don't think I mind necessarily. There have been a couple moments that I sort of rolled my eyes just a little. A couple tropes, like very early on we get we're gonna stay at this inn. Oh no, they only have one room. Oh no, there's only one bed. And the innkeeper literally says, well, there's only one bed. I did roll my eyes, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, that doesn't just happen in YA, but I will say to its credit that it did feel incredibly self-aware in that moment, and also in a few other moments that have felt a little bit more cliche, a little more tropey, especially Lettel noticing another character's jaw. What was the line that she was thinking? There was a line early on saying that his torso filled her eyeline, which just reminded me of a line from Brimstone that I just read and made a very long, in detail spoiler recap rant review of just the idea of someone being so huge that they fill your vision in that case, or fill your eyeline in this case. Like, how giant would you have to be? At least in this case, it is established that Lettel is quite a bit smaller than your average elf, and there is a reason for it, but it is definitely a trope. It does feel like Saara El-Arifi is totally aware of leaning into these tropes and doing so with a little bit of a wink and a nudge, which I do appreciate. I think part of what gets to me about these tropes being used again and again and again is when they're used so seriously and earnestly and melodramatically, because I just can't take it seriously, because I know that it's just one in a long line of authors in this exact same trope again and again and again with no variation. At least if the author knows that they're doing it and is sort of jokey about it, a little bit easier to swallow, maybe. I can't find the line about the jaw. Where did that go? It was such a silly line. Oh, maybe there it is. He wields his jawline like a weapon, Lettle thought. It feels a little bit like your standard fair romantasy in those moments, which again, there's nothing wrong with your standard fair romantasy. It's just not generally my cup of tea. See my Brimstone and Quicksilver videos if you want my reaction to your standard fair romantasy. I do like some romantasy. I recently read The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow, and I loved it. You can watch that reading vlog linked in all the places. I will say for it, it's a very easy read, very compulsively readable. I would say there's a fair amount of world building and detail about the different sort of races of people in this land and the different creatures and different forms of magic and some of the lore and history, but it's definitely not overdone. There has been no what I would consider to be info dumping so far, but I do think we're getting enough information to follow along. And I do think that there is a fair amount of world building, even if it's not as extensive as some of the epic fantasy I tend to read. I also find the characters interesting. So far, I think I'm a little bit more drawn to Lettle. I don't know if it's the little sister experience or what. I just like her a lot. I also really like how her physical disabilities are being represented, with the caveat that I don't have physical disabilities myself, so I'm not speaking firsthand for how that representation feels. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions if you've read this on the disability rep, and I'll definitely be looking up some reviews specifically focused on the disability rep once I finish it, because I'm curious how other people feel about it. But so far, it feels like it's being handled well. I'm also appreciating the sexuality and gender representation so far. Yirin is in a sapphic relationship. I don't think it has specified so far, but my impression of her is that she is a lesbian, and I'm liking that representation so far. I also like that we've met multiple characters so far who are gender fluid and or trans, and that they openly discuss the fact that their society is gender of choice, and that it is common for some people to have very fluid gender where their gender changes from day to day and their pronouns change from day to day, and they have knowledge of herbs and medicines that can alter hormone levels that are used by these trans characters. And all of it feels very enmeshed in the world. It's just well lived in, if that makes sense. It just feels like it makes sense for these characters to be here, to exist, to be part of the society, and it's very refreshing. And I find it lovely so far that they seem to be just wholeheartedly accepted and respected by everyone around them. No issues whatsoever. I think that's great. Of course, there's a place for literature that explores gender and sexuality and engages with homophobia or transphobia. But I also think it's nice sometimes to read, especially fantasy in a made-up world where it is queer norm. And trans characters, gender nonconforming characters, gender fluid characters, queer characters just exist and are allowed to exist, and they aren't hated for that. They aren't feared for that. They are just part of society along with everyone else, and they get to live their lives fully as themselves, fully accepted and loved, because that's the world that we should have. And the world is a really scary place for queer people and gender nonconforming, gender fluid, trans people right now. And sometimes it's really nice to read a book where you don't have to contend with the homophobia, the transphobia. You know? So I'm really appreciating that. It's really nice. Of course, I mentioned that with Cleopatra too. There is a lot of queer rep in Cleopatra. Most of the adult characters in Cleopatra are bisexual or pansexual, not explicitly stated what their identity is, but have sexual and romantic relationships with people of all genders. That's totally fine, and people know about it, and no one seems to react or care. I really love finding authors who incorporate queerness into their stories, especially when they do so in a varied way and so naturally, as she has done in both these books. I think that's an amazing thing, and I'm really loving that. I also really like that we're getting to know two different cultures, societies, ways of life, and that they feel very distinctly different. Their perspective on nature and animals and their place within the natural world, their perspective on resources and sharing resources, community support, violence or non-violence, their interpretation of animals' personhood or sentience is different between these two societies, and that extends all the way to one of these societies being vegetarian and the other consuming meat. and that being a point of contention or a point of sort of surprise and adjustment for our characters in realizing that the society they've entered into views I was going to say human, but they're not human, they're elves. But you get what I mean. Non-human animals as people, that they don't eat them because they view them as people. And I really appreciate that, because you'd be surprised by the number of fantasy books I read where they apparently view non-human or non-fae or non-elf or whatever animals as sentient or as people or can talk to them, but then they still eat meat like it's nothing. And I always just wonder what the logic there is. Like, it feels like it should have an impact on their diets and on how they view other animals, or animals in general. And I always appreciate when a book goes there and acknowledges the fact that a society that views animals as people is a lot less likely to eat them. Just as a very long-term vegan myself, it's just one of those things that feels like a glaring omission in world building sometimes. I just like that the world building is consistent and that there are differences between the two worlds, because I do tend to find that diet and the types of foods eaten, it's often an area of world building that goes unexamined, unexplored, and can be the same across very different societies and worlds. And that kind of breaks immersion for me, typically. So I like when an author is thinking about that. And even though, again, as I said, I don't think the world building is ridiculously extensive or anything, I can tell that Saara El-Arifi was really thinking about a lot of those little details and how these different societies are interacting with their world. And even to the point of, where certain exclamations or curses or sayings come from, and they have a different context or land differently amongst different people within a different society based on where the meaning comes from, and the implications of that to people who have different beliefs or who grew up differently. And I love that as well, because I often find, especially in romantasy, that characters have, exclamations. I always go back to One Dark Window, where everyone just yells trees, and there's no, we know why they do it, I guess, but it just feels so half-hearted, half-baked, without really thinking through the logic of why and how these sayings would evolve over time and what they would mean to different people. Anyway, I just appreciate the detail there and the fact that she's thought about those things. In terms of the plot, honestly, not that much has happened so far. Yes, things are happening. There's been there have been 3 sort of major turning points or discoveries so far, but it does feel like the plot is moving quite slowly. To be fair, I don't really mind. I really like the world that's been built. I'm enjoying just sort of existing in it and looking around and seeing everything that's there and soaking it up. I also am enjoying the characters. I find Yiren and Lettel and Ryan each interesting in their own way, and they're all endearing. And a lot of the side characters are quite endearing as well. They've just briefly interacted with several other characters who I find interesting or wholesome or funny or suspicious in a good way. Good in terms of the story way, not necessarily good in terms of how it will turn out for our characters kind of way. But yeah, maybe a little bit less plot than one would expect from fantasy so far, and less romance as well. It seems to me like our 2 sisters are each going to have their own romance, and one of the sisters starts in a relationship, but then they are separated. And so it makes sense to me that that sister seemingly is going to be much slower to develop the actual main romance of the book, because they were already in a relationship and are going to have to accept that they might not be reunited with their lover. Also seems like their dynamic is a little bit more enemies to lovers vibes, so those are usually slower burn, but so far there's very little there outside of just an initial attraction. But then the other sister already is starting to fall for their presumed love interest, but they do have something standing in the way that's causing a bit of drama already. But still, in both cases, I feel like it's moving pretty slow, which is fine. I don't necessarily mind that. I would just say that in the first half, we don't have a huge amount of plot. We also don't have a huge amount in the romance side of things. But like I said, I'm enjoying it. I'm finding it engaging. It's an easy read. I think the world is interesting. I like the characters, and I really like the representation so far. So I'm happy to keep reading, basically. And I'm going to go do that. I'm going to skip a spoiler section for now. I will do spoilers at the end, and we'll see where it goes, because I'm enjoying it so far. I wouldn't say it's an epic story or a masterpiece or something. It's not really shaping up to be my new favorite fantasy of all time, unless things really escalate in the second half, but I'm liking it. I'm enjoying it. So I'm going to go finish it now. Well, I just finished Faebound. It's kind of late, but here I am. I liked this, but this felt really under-edited to me, kind of in general, but really in the second half, really in the last few chapters especially, there were some glaring, not necessarily mistakes, but just really clunky, kind of oddly worded sentences that I feel like an editor would have smoothed out those bumps. I don't know, there was some oddness at the end especially, and then I felt like there were some threads that weren't dealt with at the end, and I know this is the first book in a trilogy, so maybe they'll be picked up again later, but it just kind of felt a little unpolished or unfinished in the end. I'm a bit confused. Blank squeezed his essential organs with his magic. And I mean, like, unless they're much more like Klingons than I thought, most organs are kind of essential. Like, why would you have to specify their essential organs? I don't know, it just feels kind of odd. There are also a couple of reveals at the end that really were pretty obvious from either very early on or at least for many, many chapters before they were revealed, but then all the characters are totally shocked. I liked these characters a lot. They were sometimes annoying or made weird decisions or said things that I just thought, okay, sure. But I liked them. I enjoyed spending time with them, but they were kind of dumb. Especially Lettel, who is supposed to have this power of divination. She gets these prophecies. She's able to sort of pick up the prophecy or read the prophecy, but she has no capability to interpret the prophecy. She doesn't even seem all that interested in trying to, which I find kind of odd. Anyway, the prophecies, one of the prophecies in particular was pretty plain, I thought, but I guess not. Everyone was shocked. We also get this line. I'll blank out the names so you don't know who I'm talking about, so it won't be a spoiler, but we get Blank's own magic sparked, but Blank wheeled on her, her fingers bloody with Blank's blood. Her fingers bloody with Blank's blood. Like, it's not wrong, it's just awkward. I don't know. There are a number of things like that near the end. It just felt kind of unpolished is the only word I can come up with. And I didn't have that feeling about the first half. Like, there were lines here and there that I thought were kind of silly or very, leaning into the tropes or cliche aspects of the genre, and that made me roll my eyes a little bit. And the language in general is much more casual, colloquial, contemporary, which does lean more towards sort of a YA vibe, but also just romantasy in general tends to have more of that like jokey, quippy, contemporary writing style. And that's not my preference. I do prefer the writing style of Cleopatra, which is a little bit more elevated and I hesitate to say lyrical. It's not quite to the level of lyrical or poetic, but it is slightly more formal or flowery language. It's a little more constructed, and at times it can come across overly constructed It's a fine line to walk, I guess, and it's so much of that is going to be personal preference. And the writing style here was fine for the most part. It was pretty straightforward, not much to notice about the writing style itself. But really in those last couple chapters, it just kind of felt like went over the book with, your normal amount of attention for the first 35 chapters. And then they kind of ran out of time. So the last few chapters, they were like, yeah, good enough on draft 2 or whatever. I don't know. Maybe it's just too late and I don't know what I'm talking about, but it just felt a little unfinished in the end, which I found odd. But that is a complaint that I've had about so many traditionally published books, and especially the last 2 years, I would say, where it just feels like if an editor was used, they did not have nearly enough time to dedicate to the book and that it was under-edited. I'm saying it generally for many books that I've read, that these books I'm reading feel very under-edited in general, and that was definitely a feeling I had here. But again, the weird thing is that the ending felt significantly less polished than the rest of the book, which just felt strange. There's also a moment where someone says a character's name and they say, that's not my name. My name is Queen, their name. But like it is. That is your name. Your name isn't Queen. That's your title. I feel like I'm being nitpicky. It's just things like that I would assume that an editor would flag and say, I don't know if we'd word it like that, I felt like the writing quality, at least for me and my personal taste, was a pretty big step down in Faebound from Cleopatra. And this is also just an earlier work, so maybe it's just a natural progression of Saara El-Arifi's style. I don't know, because these are my only 2 examples. These are my only 2 data points. But I do think that this could have used another pass by an editor, and that would have improved things. But like I said, I liked the characters. I like the world. I think it's very inventive. I think it's very unique. I like the magic. I like the different creatures and peoples. I think everything we learned about the worlds was interesting. I do think as the book progressed, a few holes showed up that weren't ever addressed, and nothing so major that it really ruined it for me. Nothing so major that I couldn't follow what was happening. But there were a few little aspects here and there that I just thought I would have loved a little bit more detail on how that works. Or, why is it that the elves need this crystal so badly to simulate sunlight? Do they not have a lot of sunlight? I feel like that was never really addressed. And at first I thought, it doesn't matter that much. This is an important resource for them, or it's more powerful than the sun or whatnot. Okay, fine. It helps them grow food. Cool. It's something that they want and need. But as it continued and as it was sort of brought back again and again, and the characters kept thinking about how important it was and how much they needed it, I just thought, okay, but why do you need it? Can you tell us? And again, not something that ruins the whole thing or makes it all fall apart. It's not a giant plot hole or something. It's just a little bit of a lack of information, and it would have been helpful or interesting to know more, Same thing with the magic. A lot of the magic was sort of underexplained. It was more of a soft magic system. And again, that's totally fine. I think I would have loved a little bit more, but I also get kind of nerdy about world building and magic systems. So I enjoy when they get a little bit more detailed. And like I said earlier, I think there are some aspects of the world building that were really well thought out and were clearly thought out to a level that is not necessarily super common in my experience, in some specific aspects of the world building. But there are other aspects of the world that were maybe underdeveloped. And in general, it felt like there were some really amazing ideas, some really cool and unique ideas, and they were only sort of half explored, And again, it's book 1 in a trilogy. Maybe all those things get explored and explained later in the trilogy. I need to remember that this is not a standalone, and so I have to kind of keep in mind that there are presumably things that will be explored at length in the other books. But there were definitely some things that I felt were brushed over more quickly than I would have liked, including, I would say, the relationships. I liked the characters. I liked the relationships. I liked the 2 main romantic relationships. I liked a lot of the other relationships that were developing and being explored. I did feel like the romantic relationships were kind of rushed a little bit. We didn't really get as much time with the characters and to really feel the development of their attraction and their love. And I think, again, because I just read Cleopatra, so I'm comparing it to this, I was full on giddy, giggling, kicking my feet, blushing, reading about Cleopatra and Caesar in this book. So I was really comparing it pretty directly reading Faebound. And here, even though I liked the characters, I was just sort of meh about their relationships. Like, happy for them, good for you, but I wasn't as invested, I would say. Their relationships didn't hit me in the feels in the same way, you know? There was so much varied representation in sexuality, gender. I thought that was amazing. I loved that it was queer norm, very intertwined through everything in a way that I really appreciated. I'm not an expert, but I felt that the disability rep was well handled, felt respectful, and I had fun with it. It was an easy, quick, enjoyable read for the most part. I do think it could have been a little more polished. I do think there were some missed opportunities. I also think maybe I would say the same thing I did about Cleopatra, where I feel like this could have been a little bit longer, maybe. But also, I don't know, it's not like it's that short. It just had a very languid pacing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It almost reads more like a cozy fantasy, like low stakes cozy fantasy where not a lot happens, even though technically there are higher stakes and things do happen. But the tone of it sort of feels very like found family cozy fantasy, even though that's kind of not what it's doing. I don't know. It's sort of sitting in a weird middle ground, a liminal space. But I do like cozy fantasy, so maybe that's why I enjoyed just hanging out in the world. But it did feel a little at odds with the rest of the setup. You know, I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read Faebound. I'm clearly so sort of unable to categorize what this is and what it's doing. I will do a spoiler section. And kind of like with Cleopatra, I'll hope that by the time I'm done talking about spoilers, I will have finalized my rating, because right now I really don't know. I'm thinking I'll pick up the next book just to kind of see where it goes. I am curious what happens next, and I enjoyed just hanging out in this world enough that I would be willing to do it again. But it's definitely not something I would rush out to read right away. I think it was fine, good. Okay, let's talk spoilers. There's a couple things I want to talk about that are spoilery, so I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to spoil Faebound now. You can skip this using the chapters in the description box if you don't want to be spoiled, but spoilers for Faebound are starting now. And there were a number of twists and reveals that felt very heavily telegraphed from early on. I mean, some of them are literally part of these predictions, these prophecies. And one of them in particular, about the two deaths, the pearl and the gold and the pearl, I think is how it was worded, was very obvious that it was going to be the two queens. Like, we have two queens. I don't know. From early on, I was thinking, okay, the queens are going to die. That's clearly what that prophecy is saying. But not only did Lettle not really tell anyone about it or seem to try to figure out the prophecy for the vast majority of the book, then when she finally sits down and tries to figure it out, she decides it must mean her sister and Fury. Fury is the love interest of her sister, who is part of the royal family but not on the throne currently. And like, why? For what reason? And she's like, sure now that it's them, and she's got to go save them right away. But she was wrong. It was the queens. And I thought, oh, I mean, yeah, obviously it was the queen. What do you mean? Why did you think it was them? I don't know. Didn't make sense to me. Also, the fact that Comey, who is the only other elf in this entire realm, just happens to be there already. There's a big reveal that he is, in fact, the evil tyrant chief of the Waxing Elves. I think it was the Waxing tribe, which was the group that Ryan was born into, and then he defected to join the Waning team. And his name is Chief Acomedo. And no one at any point in finding out that this elf has been a prisoner here for a long time and is one of the Waxing Elves, whose name is Comey, Komi, could possibly be the tyrant Chief Acomedo, with Comey, like, it's just an A at the start and an extra dough at the end. I don't know, that reveal really got to me. I was like, really? Really? Some of the naming in this book got to me a lot, to be honest. We have Ryan instead of Ryan. We have nothing wrong with the name Yirin. I actually like it a lot, but the narrator in the audiobook pronounces it Urine, which was a little distracting. But then we also have the little sister whose name is Lettle. And then we have Fury, who is the fae with a temper issue. And then we have Comey, who is in deep cover. No one would possibly guess that Comey is actually Acomedo. We also get a moment where they're saying that one of the fae was a traitor to her, meaning Yirin. And the waning tribe because he was working with the waxing tribe. But like, he's not a traitor. He's not one of you. He was never one of you. How and why would he be a traitor? He's a completely different species of being who is a complete third party to this whole situation. And he decided to ally himself with your enemy. But that doesn't mean that he's a traitor to you specifically or to the waning tribe, because he never pledged allegiance to you. He never said he was going to help. Like, I don't know, especially near the end, quite a few where I would read something and think, well, no, what? Again, calling her Fury, and she says, my name is Queen Fury. It's like, no, your name is still Fury. You didn't change your name to Queen. Queen is your title. Your name is still Fury. There are so many ways that you could have basically that exact interaction that would make more sense than saying my name is Queen Fury. I don't know. Anyway, I don't need to rant about it. I already brought up some of these things in the non-spoiler section. I'm just going through my notes and thinking some of these things were so odd. And I just feel like, again, an editor would have read it and said, oh, that's a little awkward. I do feel, I feel like the one thing that I didn't guess was that Ryan was actually half Fae and was going to become the king and have to stay. And so then Lettel would stay with him. Honestly, I liked Ryan a lot at the start, but then once they actually got to the Fae city, the underground city, he disappeared a lot and was barely on the page. And there's a reason for that, because he was bonding with one of the cute little, well, not so little cats with horns, and hanging out with his new little buddy, which is great and all, but he wasn't really on the page nearly as much in the second half of the book. And so the reveal felt sort of out of left field a little bit for me. It's fine. I don't really mind it. That was the only reveal that I found surprising. It's not surprising in terms of tropes of the genre and the idea that all the characters who are actually in the book are going to have some special power or be a chosen one or something. I did kind of think that Ryan was just going to be like a normal dude, and I kind of liked that. So it's a little too bad that he was a special chosen one, but it's fine. I think it's fine. It did seem obvious that Fury was going to become queen, and then that was going to put a wedge between her and Yiren, because Yiren was going to want to go back and help her people. She's pretty committed to the cause, at least to helping the children who are going hungry and need resources. Again, we don't have a super clear idea of why they can't feed everyone and why they need the crystals to feed everyone and what is going wrong with their agriculture industry, with farming, that they can't grow crops without the crystals. But anyway, she is going to want to go back to her people, but now that Fury is queen, she can't leave. They're going to have to be separated. As she's leaving, she's thinking about how she hopes she can return to her love. And again, I didn't really feel the love. I could feel the budding love. I could feel the friendship developing and a little bit of the care between them, but it didn't feel like we got enough time or development for them to really be in love to that degree. We just didn't spend as much time on it as we could have, I guess. I don't know. If you've read Faebound, let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I just feel sort of mystified is the wrong word, but it's close to how I feel, because I liked so many aspects of this, but there was just something missing in how everything coalesced. And there were so many little clunky aspects to it, especially in that last section, that could have been worked a little bit more. And I just kind of felt detached emotionally, despite liking the characters and rooting for them. They've killed the tyrant. Does that mean that the war is going to be over? She's going back now to her people, to the elves. Is she bringing a stash of this crystal to help her people? Is that going to destabilize something because she doesn't understand the larger, socio-political factors that are leading to this war and why they actually need the crystal so much, and potentially it's being hoarded by certain people and not shared amongst everyone? I don't know. I'll probably read the next book just because I'm curious where it will go, but I'm a little bit disappointed in how it all came together. It felt a little bit like a missed opportunity, or that the potential wasn't fully realized, I would really like to read your thoughts on Faebound. If you've read it, please share your thoughts in the comments. I need to talk to someone about this because I don't know how to feel. I really don't know how to feel. But I think that's it for spoilers. I'm just a little bit at a loss. I feel like ultimately what I come to is that I liked so many different aspects of this. I had a good time reading it for the most part. I did find some of the choices, and sometimes even just some of the specific word choices or ways that certain sentences were constructed, especially near the end, to be kind of baffling and very clunky. And I did feel a little bit like this was a missed opportunity, or that this had a huge amount of potential and it didn't quite meet it. It didn't execute it as well as I would have expected, especially after reading Cleopatra. I think for me, this was an entertaining enough read, and I probably will, like I said, get the audiobook for my library for the next book and listen to it at some point. But I don't feel any great urgency to necessarily. I think that this is a 3-star read for me. It has its issues, but it also has a lot going for it that I really liked. I think it's interesting and unique and kind of a fun time, but I do think it was a little rough around the edges. And I think that's where I'll leave it because I feel like I'm talking myself in circles. 3 stars for Faebound. I'm a little bit disappointed, but I still enjoyed my time with it. I just think that my expectations were a little higher than what was delivered, especially after reading Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a 4-star read for me and definitely more to my taste than Faebound, at least in terms of writing style, and it felt more polished and more complete, more of a finished product. I might check out her debut fantasy trilogy at some point, just to have another data point to compare to. And I'm definitely interested to see what she does next and would be interested in picking up her work, especially if she does more standalones or more historical fiction or retellings, because like I said, I really felt like Cleopatra was more to my taste, and I'd be curious to see what she would do next if she continued on in that vein. I think where I've kind of landed from this initial taste test of Saara El-Arifi's work is that she and I are aligned on a lot of things. She seems like a cool person. I like a lot of her ideas. I like how she thinks about things. I like some of the themes that she seems to be interested in exploring. And I really love the diversity of representation in both of these books. I would love to see more of that. And I'm definitely excited to follow her career and read more of her work and see where she goes. I think she has potential to become a favorite author of mine with a few more books and a little bit more honing of her style, because there are so many pieces there that I really love, and it just feels like they need to be nudged a little bit to like slot right into place, and then everything will be euphoric for everyone involved, you know? So I think that's where I'm at. This was a really interesting experiment. I would love to hear your thoughts on Saara El-Arifi if you've read her work. Do her books work for you? Does her style work for you? What's your favorite of hers you've read so far if you have a ranking? Let me know your thoughts on Cleopatra and Faebound if you've read either of them or both of them. I would love to hear what you thought. Do you agree with my assessments of them? Do you disagree? Did you have a completely different experience? Or are we kind of on the same page? I would love to chat more. If there's another author you want me to check out, do a taste test video for, leave them down below. If you haven't read these books but you made it all the way to the end, leave the emoji that represents either Cleopatra or Faebound to you in the comments so I know you're a real one. Thank you so much for watching this whole video. I appreciate you so much. Don't forget to use code PLANT15 for an extra 15% off Suri. Click the link in my description box or scan this QR code to shop. Thank you again so much to Suri for sponsoring this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.